All right, welcome to another episode. This one's going to be a little bit different. We're going to do a sort of a wrap up of the week past or current events. There's obviously a lot of developments in some of the topics we've talked about before, including Deepseek. So yeah, we'll start there. So I guess when we first spoke about it in the previous episode, it was kind of the new kid on the block, and there was a bunch of hype around it, and obviously a lot of concern about the potential for it to disrupt these large, mega costly, highly financed companies like OpenAI that have built foundational models for billions and billions of dollars. And the suggestion was that this new entrant being open source and from China, given the export restrictions and so forth, was a real shot across the bow that you didn't need billions of dollars to do this. But it's since come to pass that it sounds like they've had acquired a huge amount of compute, 50,000 Hopper GPUs. So it isn't a tiny little $6 million operation. $6 million is apparently just the last training run that cost. So it's probably far more comparable to some of the large models than initially expected. So what are your guys' thoughts? Does it change your perspective on the environment and I guess the disruption, the disruptive nature that it had on the economy? Don't all go at once.
Yeah. Mike, you want to go? You want to take a kick at it?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay.
You love Deepseek. You love the developments. I know you're tracking it closely, so you're definitely going to be more qualified to speak on this than I am.
About it. Okay, so let's talk about the I guess this disruption, the AI's disruption on the economy. Is that what you're suggesting, Kyle, that we talked about?
Yeah, well, ultimately the big fallout was essentially the concern, I believe, the concern that the market had that we were the Western countries were spending, or specifically the US, was spending huge sums of money on private, entrenched proprietary models that were performance-wise were then challenged by a relatively unknown upstart from a country that shouldn't have had access to premium compute resources. And so how on earth were they able to compete within a relatively short window? So there was about 3 month delay between the competing research product from OpenAI to when DeepSeek R1 was released. And so I think there was some legitimate questions around, like, are we on the wrong path? Are they doing something novel? And it's interesting because there's a lot of people that have said credit where credit is due. They've taken a novel approach, and that novel approach was as a result of their constraints. So there's no question that Chinese developers do not have access to the compute resources because of the trade embargo. So they don't typically get access to first generation GPU. So they could do it with third-party GPUs or other types of GPUs, or they essentially, like what DeepSeek has done, or it sounds like they've done, which is acquired a bunch of older hardware, a couple of years older, but still not cutting edge. And because of that, they've had to create novel ways of processing and distilling these models, and in ways that which a large, well-funded company like an OpenAI would never need to do. And as a result of that, that the necessity is the mother of invention. So that necessity to do more with less has led to this real reimagining of that pipeline, of that training pipeline. So I think there's legitimate, they definitely have achieved things that deserve to be acknowledged. I think there's some of it that's been overblown in terms of the access to compute and so forth. This isn't a tiny little operation. A lot of people understood this to be like some part-time kids in an office. Like, that's not what this is at all. There's billions of dollars worth of compute at hand here. So it's just, again, it's a novel approach. And the fact that they've released it open source, essentially every major provider of AI is offering a locally hosted DeepSeek R1 instance. So if you go to Perplexity, for example, they will offer you a US hosted version of DeepSeek. And it gets around a lot of the privacy constraints and stuff like that of using DeepSeek directly. But ironically, people like Microsoft are hosting it as well on Azure. And Microsoft are a main investor, arguably the main investor in OpenAI. So it's a competing product, and they're hosting it and offering it to their clients at a fraction of the cost of OpenAI. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. What are your guys' thoughts on the impact, I guess, on the broader economy in terms of valuing AI assets? And secondly, the approachability of open source and being able, as you're a company or you're a small business, it gives you a lot more options if you want to manage stuff yourself. You clearly are able to get your hands on tools that are comparable or close to cutting edge, that are not proprietary, that you can control and that you can host yourself.
I think like what's interesting about this is that there's a lot of talks about how expensive it is, and how expensive it is to all the compute power and everything like that. The issue around that is, I think, people are so focused on this cost, but what they don't, I think people are not, forgetting is the cost to train all these models. Right, the training cost, that's really what costs a lot. And I think recently, even Google already committed about $75 billion towards essentially AI, committing it to AI and et cetera.
I think Meta's doing the same. I think they're going hard right now on training and developing a better version of what's Meta's AI called again?
Llama.
Yeah,
Or
Llama.
sorry, Llama.
Yeah, Llama.
Llama.
Apparently, they're going to come out with they're brewing a really heavy duty AI model that's going to be coming out shortly. And I think that there's lots of talks, like the advantage Google has. I mean, Facebook has is access to data. So that's what I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask you guys this. These models keep getting faster and faster, more efficient at distilling information. But at what point does the bottleneck become access to the data versus the compute and processing power? Just think about it. These things are getting faster and faster, and they're getting more efficient. But the bottleneck, is it not going to be the data? Like, how much data can these things, access that's publicly available? Because a lot of these data sources aren't publicly available. So these models, what I believe is they don't have access to them. If it's not public data, how are these models scraping that data or getting access to it? Like, say a routers, for example. Routers, you have to pay a subscription to get access to their articles and their news. How are these models accessing that data?
Yeah, so there's a few different approaches, but to this point, a lot of it has just, again, it's been reliant on public information, but other public sources, like if you look at X or Twitter, they shut down or they limited their API access because OpenAI was essentially using their API to scrape Twitter. Well, now that's a competitive advantage for XAI and their Grok product because it's the same company, right? They have access to that data set. And vice versa. It's a very good point about Meta and Facebook, where Facebook has a proprietary data set. I think even more importantly, if you look at the monetization piece, they also have a user base. Google doesn't really have, I guess Google has a user base through its workplace products, its enterprise products, but it's not the same sort of interface, and people aren't interacting with it the way that they are a social media network. So that's going to be a really, really unique data set, and it's going to be a really unique use case or user connection. If you're offering somebody an AI product on Facebook that they're prepared to pay $1 or $2 or whatever, versus Google, I guess you could sort of say the same thing if you're rolling it into those workplace products. But no, 100%, and that's
big advantage Llama's going to have, or anyone that has access to that data. I think that's going to be that the next iteration of AI as it continues to advance. I think it's going to come down to who has access to the most data. No different than our businesses. It's all about data, and that's going to be the bottleneck. That's going to be worth its weight in gold. And whatever model has access to proprietary data, such as Facebook and Llama, that's going to give them a big advantage. And the other thing that I think that we got to talk about or consider is think about the model versus powering the model. Like you mentioned Azure, Microsoft's Azure. We talk about NVIDIA, and NVIDIA has that proprietary software that they've built to power their chips. So I think companies are going to have to decide which kind of angle how they're going to position themselves. Are they focused on building this model, or are they focused on building the compute? I don't know if I'm looking at that correctly. Am I looking at that? Am I?
Yeah. So there's like really it comes down to those two major aspects of building an AI model. Is the training aspect, which utilizes tons and tons of data, and that's where you need those GPU to really, I guess, kind of think of it like compresses the data and feed it into the AI so that it can learn. So the training aspect of it requires a ton of computing power. And then the other part of it is the inference part, which is the part that we're used to. We're interacting with the AI, and the AI is extracting that information out to us. So that's essentially how these models are built. And I think DeepSeek has done a really good job on the inference part, but the training part still requires a lot of computing power.
Yeah,
So
and I think the additional thing that a lot of people are obviously focusing on throughout that is you need the energy to power the GPU. So like, yes, there's a data constraint, there's a restriction on the data, but you can also make synthetic data. So you can have an AI that generates data to train off of, or you can just do multiple runs to make the outputs a little bit more efficient and more effective from the same amount of data. But to your point about the GPU energy, like the level of energy required to run these compute clusters is absolutely insane. Like if you look at the Kevin O'Leary project in Alberta, northern Alberta, they're talking about gigawatts of power just to run clusters of GPUs. Like that's more power than the entire province demands. Like it's absolutely staggering. Like we were looking at it internally of running a GPU compute cluster, and it was like 10x the most power, more power than we would ever be able to supply it like locally. Like it's absolutely astronomical, the level of energy, and inversely the level of cooling that you need. So interestingly, like again, these big clusters like Grok or XAI have created where it's all water cooled, really sophisticated, data centers, because they demand so much power and reliable power. So they've got a Tesla battery backup, bunch of Tesla trailers connected, so that the spikes of power as GPUs ramp up and down, it doesn't actually impact the utility and risk essentially throwing a breaker on the utility supply. So they have consistent power. So like all of these moves around, like, big tech companies buying nuclear reactors or contracting for power and stuff like that, like that's going to be a major, major issue going forward. And the All In guys this week talked about, if the main competitor is China, China is exponentially better at bringing capacity online, new power generation, even if it's coal. They're way better at it, and the power itself is significantly cheaper. So if we look at the cost of energy and access to energy as sort of the main driver of development and innovation and other products, like we're not focusing where we need to be focusing.
Interesting. So
yeah.
yeah, so I think of it like a supply chain. So with OpenAI, for example, and DeepSeek, like how many components of the supply chain are they controlling? So you mentioned like the distillation, the training, but they're using Azure for the data centers. They're using third-party energy providers, like, because I know some companies are developing their own energy sources. So like how many points of the supply chain are some of these large AI companies controlling? And does it make sense to control the whole supply chain, or just specialize in one area of it? Because if AI is so new, I'm trying to wrap my head around it myself, and I'm just trying to think of what does the supply chain look like from start to finish to give us users access to AI. When I go in and I start typing in a chat box, and I get my output, what went into that? How, like, all the way to the start. It started with energy. It started with computers, training,
Tons and
hosting.
tons
Like,
of
what does the supply chain look like, and how much of that do they control?
so interesting. Yeah, like I think it's an interesting question. Is that there's lots that's involved in that one query. That when we type something into this chat bot, or we think
I
is a
think there's
chat
a
bot,
genie in there.
but it's actually a lot of computing powers that goes on behind the scene that we're not even aware of. Like the example is the 4.0 model. Like you say, if you were to use a 4.0 model on OpenAI ChatGPT, and you use their O3 model, the newest one. So what you're going to start to see is the delay in it, spitting out a result, right? Spitting out some sort of answer, and that delay is actually, I think, caused by the amount of computing power it requires that in the background. So it's running multiple iterations of this thing, and it is essentially picking out the best one, right? So that's why the cost is so high on these on these models, because you're essentially just running this thing like multiple times, and it's running for like a minute sometimes I've seen, to develop that reasoning. And that's what makes it so powerful, that's reasoning, right? Even though it's slower, but it's running so many times in the background, it gives you the best answer. And that's why you're seeing better writing and better reasoning and better codes being generated by this O3 model. So that requires a lot of computing power, and going to your supply chain.
Yeah, the vertical integration, like how are they vertically integrated?
Yeah, it's there's a lot that goes on behind the scene there.
I don't think
Hyperscaler.
that they are vertically integrated though. Like again, like Microsoft doesn't own power generation. They buy chips from Nvidia. Nvidia buys chips from a third party fab in Taiwan. Like to your point, like none of it is integrated. And I think that's the concern, right? Like I think we've all read articles about how the GPU microprocessor industry is the most highly at risk from a national security perspective on earth, because one GPU has like 10,000 suppliers all over the world. And so if one of those, pieces were to fall out, you wouldn't have a GPU and you couldn't supply the AI industry as a whole. And the other piece is like, what about downstream of that? So what happens when AI becomes, and I definitely take the perspective that it's going to be pretty ubiquitous in the next 5 to 10 years, to the point where it's almost like a utility at that point. Like whoever's providing it, whether they're vertically integrated or not, they're going to be providing it like, cell phone data or internet ISPs or whatever. And this kind of dovetails with another thing that happened this week, which was the trade war. But what happens if we're all reliant, or our companies are reliant on a utility or a service provider out of the US being an AI provider with a data center in, who knows, Mississippi? And then suddenly our governments have a falling out and we either are paying exponentially more or we don't have access to it.
Who
So
owns
is
the
that,
listeners? That's what I want to know.
Like Ontario ripping up the contract with Starlink.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then immediately putting it back together.
Yeah, you're right. Like it's so
Although the
fragile that
capacity.
it can just basically be dropped on a whim, right? So it is very
But
fragile.
these data centers are third-party data centers, it sounds like. Are they owned by
There,
you?
Kyle, you might know about this one, right? Like I
Yeah,
think
who owns the data center?
So it depends on the entity, but they're typically not owned. They're typically third-party outsourced operators. And so, for example, like OpenAI, so they'll raise billions of dollars from Microsoft, but those billions of dollars are essentially being paid to Microsoft to use their data center. So Microsoft has a lot of hardware. Meta does as well. Meta's for over a decade, they've done a really good job of essentially crafting their own hardware solutions because they didn't want to. But Amazon is kind of the leader. So a lot of, I would say, most of the sort of third party software tech sort of stack runs on mostly Amazon AWS. So that's again a third party data center provider.
Except OpenAI, they're on Azure, Microsoft Azure, right?
They're on Microsoft, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I believe Anthropic is on AWS, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Meta has their own. They've built their own data centers, it sounds like.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, they're running off.
they're advanced.
And same thing with XAI. Actually, that's so I stand corrected. So XAI are a good example of one that's close to vertically integrated. Granted, they're still buying GPUs, but they've built out this absolutely massive cluster that they own and they run for XAI. So they're not reliant on any third-party hardware provider, or sorry, third-party service providers.
Data centers, yeah. So what's interesting is like data centers. I think it's prevalent that the hyperscalers are building them out in the U.S., right? Because it's the regulation, the laws are a bit more flexible here. But yeah, when you get to places like Europe, for example, it's very restrictive, and there's probably going to be more third party there. The hyperscalers will likely rent them out, or have certain build out by a third party REIT or something like that will build out these data centers and then rent them out to hyperscalers. So it really depends, I think, heavily on the regulations in those specific countries. Yeah.
So interesting that you mentioned X maintains their own like data centers and hosting. Like Elon is like so bullish on vertical integration. If you look at all the companies he owns, he operates, they're all really vertically integrated.
The thing that blows my mind about stuff like Tesla is every single piece of software that they run, including their insurance operation. So their CRM, their finance, accounting, everything is done in-house. Everything was built in-house.
Crazy.
Like that's pretty crazy. That's a huge dedication to vertical integration. But the supply chain is the same way, right? Like they own recycling plants, they own, all of it. If they can get closer to the supply of, nickel or whatever for batteries, than they do. But yeah, it's an interesting point. But again, like coming back to if we as an economy, if we're sort of at arm's length to all of these resources that we will inevitably be dependent on in the future, from a national perspective, should we be a bit more focused on developing those resources so that we have a fallback? Like I remember early on in the AI discussion, there was a lot of concern about the cost, because the implication was that, well, if it's cost prohibitive, if it takes $10 billion to play in this realm, what happens to research universities? What happens to people learning about this, especially smaller countries like Canada? Like, how are we going to get access to this? How are we going to be able to actually compete if we can't afford to? And so I think Deepseek has shown us that, you obviously need some money, but you don't need to be the market leader to be able to be at the cutting edge. So shouldn't we be, creating a bit more of a national strategy around it to say, making sure that we have access to these critical resources in the future?
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, I think it's very important that we maintain access to it. And yeah, just DeepSeek kind of showed us that, basically we can improve on software and we can improve its efficiency. And I'm a bit surprised that I guess the market never saw that software can get more efficient, right? Like it's just a matter of writing more efficient codes and writing better and more efficient AI models. So it's very to me, DeepSeek kind of exposed something that's very positive for the industry, because this will further encourage development of AI. Is going to increase adoption of AI across, because it's technically a lot cheaper now for inference. And on the back end, the hyperscalers will still spend a ton of money training and building newer and more advanced models. So there's two things here. Inference is getting cheaper. I think it's going to increase adoption across the industry, many different industries. I think industries are going to adopt AI in some way, in some shape or form. And it's just going to drive more demand for more more efficient models and more accurate models, right? And it's gonna advance things like AI agents. We're going to see more and more applications of it, and that I think is the impact on the economy. So going back to your original question, Kyle.
Yeah, we got to put a pin in the AI chat for a second. So Michael, what's your perspective on the US Canada element? So in the sense of what happened this week was, obviously the US administration threatened tariffs that were going to come in February 1st. And there was an absolute mad scramble on both sides of the border to try and figure out how it's going to impact everybody and what we should do going forward. And I thought it was quite ironic that everybody is suddenly saying, oh, buy Canadian, like this is what you can replace this American product with this Canadian product. And oh, we should be trading more with each other. Oh, look at how much business we're doing with the States at the expense of our Canadian neighbors. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, first off, you read my mind. I'm glad you put a pin in the AI thing, because I know you and Andrew can just go on for hours on AI. We might as well call this the AI podcast with you two running it. But I'm glad. I wanted to talk about that. Since in light of doing this roundup, yeah, there has been some movement on the tariffs. Trump decided to give a 30-day extension in terms of negotiating a deal with Canada on the tariffs. And I was hoping we could get to that topic because it's very interesting. There's lots of controversy around it in terms of, is this another negotiating tactic from Trump? Is this just delaying the inevitable that's coming? Or is this an opportunity for Canada now to change their approach and rather than take the initial approach, and I shouldn't say Canada, Ontario in specific, like Ontario was very bullish. They were very strong with their response. They wanted to meet the U.S. and Trump with an act of strength and force, and they were proposing counter tariffs. They were proposing pulling product off the shelves. That usually doesn't work very well with Trump. Like I hate to say it, he's a bit egotistical. And if you're trying to, muscle someone or force someone into something that's just gonna like Trump, you're gonna hurt his ego and he's just gonna push back harder. So that was the wrong approach. I think the premier of Alberta was doing a good job at that, not pushing back with Trump like a rock on a rock. So I don't know. Now, what I'm interested to see, and I haven't read much since it's happened, but I'm interested to see how we change our approach with this 30-day extension. Now, do we take more meaningful negotiations moving forward, or do we sit down Trump or the right individuals in a room and talk about, hey, what can we do that's best for both countries here? Rather than saying, hey, we're going to impose this, we're going to counter impose that, making public statements. That's not the approach. I don't know. I have yet to see what Canada's doing. They've kept the curtain down quite well. I haven't heard or read of anything in terms of what they're planning on doing to approach this renegotiation in 30 days, less than 30 days.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, like I think it's a very interesting point that you brought up, Mike. That if anybody read his book, Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, you'll see that he has a very interesting approach to negotiation, and his tactics are always very unconventional. He can say things, he can do things that are very unconventional that will throw things off, and just creates a lot of chaos. And this is what we saw the past week, right? We just saw a lot of chaos. He implemented it. He was firm. He took a hard stance that tariffs are going to come into effect on February 1st. He kept his word. This is his style. So I think it's interesting that we're seeing the essentially some of the things that are starting to change in Canada as well. Like Trump essentially got some things that he was after, essentially tightening up the border, reducing the flow of fentanyl into his country. And I think just having that commitment, I guess, bought us an extra 30 days of time. But you're right. The concern is right now, what are we doing within these next 30 days that will, either abolish this tariffs or have it throw us into chaos again, right? And that's we haven't seen much from the government. We haven't seen what's their plan. But what we've seen is they've committed to work with Trump on the border, because I think everybody saw how real this tariff can be and what impact it can have on our country and our economy. Right? We saw the currencies, tanked. I think it was something like 147, 148. One US dollar is like 148 Canadian dollar, right when that news came out, and it really made it real, I think, for all of us. So within the next 30 days, it's going to be very interesting to see what the government is going to do. And I think, Mike, you brought up a very good point. If anybody understands Trump and his way of negotiating, it is not to take a retaliatory approach and retaliate against some of these things, but instead call him up, like the Mexican president called him up early morning on Monday, had a discussion, and got that 30-day extension right away. I think opening up those dialogue, having discussions with him is key.
I think just to add one last thing, I think what's important, and for sure, Andrew, like I completely agree with that. But I think what's important is determining what Trump's motive is. What's the motive? So at first, it was a little unclear to me. There was lots of talk about the border security, lots of talk about fentanyl, even though, I think Kyle shared the statistics of like 0.1% of the fentanyl coming to the US was from Canada. So that doesn't really make sense. But I think that one of the big motives for Trump, we can talk about this, what you guys think are the motives behind these tariffs are. I think one of the big motives is bringing manufacturing back into the US. I think Trump they talk about the Mar-Lago. There's a term for it, but anyways, basically there's an agenda where they want to bring manufacturing back to the US. And this might be one of the ways that Trump is looking at getting this done or aiding in that. So I don't know if that's the answer or not, but Canada needs to take an approach that, hey, you know what? Let's help you get manufacturing up in the US. We want to support that. It doesn't mean just because we're exporting product to the US doesn't mean we're taking manufacturing away. Like if we're supplying, resources, if we're supplying unfinished products or any kind of materials that can be used towards manufacturing, why is that taking away manufacturing from the US? Like, can they look at it that angle? Do you guys think, Kyle, do you think that's the driving factor? And how can we negotiate in a way that will support what Trump really wants to achieve?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, because I don't think that anybody really knows that motivation. And that was a lot of where the frustration from both Canada and Mexico came from, was it didn't really make sense, the fentanyl stuff.
Is it for income? Is he trying to drive income into the country to
Well,
alleviate other taxes?
there's definitely that. And there's this historical reference when the US had very high tariffs, it generated a lot of income for the state. And so ideally the trade-off is that if you have large tariffs, and let's be honest, tariffs across the world are not new, right? Like Canada has hundreds of percent markups on all sorts of things to protect industries like dairy. And so, Norway, I saw an example where some of the European leaders were criticizing the way that this was handled by Trump, when in reality, like Norway, most of their major industries are protected with tariffs in the 200 to 300% range. So this isn't a new playbook by any means. I think the way with which he's gone about it has surprised a lot of people. But if you look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, there is only a little bit of flexibility, and one of the carve outs is on national security grounds. And so it makes sense that he had to find something that he could rationalize as a national security threat in order to try and essentially renegotiate that trade agreement. And there's no question that I think that he wants to onshore and grow the economy as much as he can. But to your point, the way that these economies are already intertwined is very much like you described, where our industry and Mexican industry are providing sort of intermediary parts. And especially with the auto industry, they apparently, I don't have any firsthand experience with it, but apparently they'll send parts back and forth across the border, multiple times before the end product, a vehicle, is actually ready to be sold. And same thing goes for Mexico. Like there's a huge, massive manufacturing base that is supporting essentially assembly operations in the US for manufacturers. And it's purely been done because the labor is cheaper. And so if it's a task that is difficult or undesirable that would cost them significantly more to do in the US, then they're going to outsource it to Mexico or Canada. And I don't think that is going to change, unless their hand is forced, and there's a motivation for them to bring that back to the US. However, I still don't think that that's a desirable. Like we talked about this on one of the first episodes. Like, what is the comparative advantage? Do we, as a country, want to be growing a low value, high volume type industry, or do we want to be exporting and selling our talents and our intellect and our people, rather than like we're going to make widgets and we're going to cut costs more than Asia to be competitive with Asia, and we're going to subsidize it with state money. Like, I don't think that that's a winning strategy for anybody, including the US. So I think it would be really interesting to see what the main motivation is. I definitely think that it's far beyond, the border security topic. I think it's economic through and through. Like that administration is focused on economics. So I think that he's perceiving there to be value lost, or at least given away to Canada and Mexico, that could be onshored or more likely nearshored to those facilities or those manufacturers. I just don't know that that's really a wise decision in terms of labor costs and productivity and so forth. But we'll see. We'll see.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very
Did
interesting.
you see the Andrew Tate video?
Pardon?
Did anyone see the Andrew Tate video?
Yeah, no,
Andrew, I think you saw it.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. But what's interesting is, I don't know if you guys heard, when Trump stepped off the plane after those tariffs were implemented, that there was a question that came up about the Fed and the fact that the Fed kept the rates the same. He was saying that was the right decision. There's a lot of talks right now, I think, which is very interesting. It's an angle that I never thought about, was the motives behind, trying to control the Fed without directly controlling the Fed. So essentially, Trump, we kind of know that he probably wants lower rates, without actually telling the Fed to lower the rates, because it's not a good thing to do as a president, because the Fed really is supposed to be independent in a way. So there's basically talks about him, using other mechanisms within the government to force the Fed to lower rates. And one of them is the tariffs, right? Like, implementing tariffs and things like that would cause, essentially Fed to either lower rates, or even doing that through some, treasury bonds, long-term treasury bonds, through the government, I believe. So that's an interesting angle. Maybe that is part of the motive, that he's after as well. But yeah, so everybody's trying to guess. That's the $1 million question right now. What is he trying to do with all of these tariffs discussion?
Yeah. So what should Canada do going forward, or what should people in our position do going forward? We talked about it briefly before in diversification and using it as an opportunity to try and chase, new sources of revenue and stuff like that. But clearly, if we're going to lose, or at least our number one customer is going to buy a lot less from us, should we be buying Canadian goods? Should we be focusing on, protectionist policies, or should we be playing ball and saying, let's try and work this out?
Where's the nationalism in Canada? Why do we have to think about, why are we considering this now, buying Canadian goods? Because now a 25% tariff was threatened. It was thrusted upon us, the potential of this tariff, and now everyone's scrambling and thinking we need to buy Canadian goods, we need to support Canada. Why now? Well, this should have been happening from the very beginning. I think Canada needs to do a better job at having a national identity, having an identity and supporting locally. I think Canada hasn't done a great job at that. I know in other countries they're very supportive. They have an identity, and they're very supportive, especially the U.S. They're very supportive of their people, of their legislator, and their products, and what's made in that country. I feel like Canada lacks that, and now we're trying to scramble and say, hey, let's buy Canadian products. This should have been the case from the very beginning. Why weren't we buying Canadian products from the beginning?
I buy Canadian maple syrup.
Me too.
I find it hilarious. So I've lived overseas in Europe for a bit, and I find it fascinating that you go anywhere in Europe, and the countries, granted the history and the language is very unique, but it is incredibly easy to tell when you're in Germany, what companies are German, or you ask somebody like what companies are German and what companies are not German. And that differentiator is very, very clear. And it's very common for people to want to support domestic industry. So they buy those products or they shop at those stores or whatever. I feel like Canada is the total opposite. Like even our prime minister, he made a gaffe when he said, don't buy Heinz ketchup. Heinz ketchup has a manufacturing facility where they make ketchup in Canada outside Montreal. Like the prime minister doesn't even know that. So like, we're so like the culture and the identity, like you say, is so far from where it needs to be. And the conversation, like the political class doesn't put any time and energy into this. If anything, our current and most recent prime minister has done a huge disservice because he hasn't really done a good job of trying to, bridge those gaps across the country. But we as a nation are not on the same page. We do not trade together. We do not talk to each other. It's really bad. It's really bad. So that's definitely priority number one in my mind.
Yeah,
Most of the provinces, their highest exports are to other countries as opposed to other provinces within Canada. I don't have the statistics. We could pull them up, but it's wild.
It's
wild.
huge. It's like 70-30. It's all US. 70% revenue from the US, 30% from Canada. Which is shocking.
Demand, right? Other provinces have demand. It's not like there's no demand. Like there's demand, but we're getting our product elsewhere and sending our product elsewhere.
You know what? I think it's because, like the part of it, we talk about this all the time, right? It's just I guess the dispersion of people within Canada. Like we're kind of far apart. First of all, we're not very dense, and the market potential in the U.S. is so big. It's 10 times the market size, and just companies, just even Canadian companies, are looking to sell to the U.S. because that's the market. Imagine you push a product out there, you have access to 300 million people versus like 30.
I agree with that sentiment, but I do think that we're doing ourselves a disservice, because I've heard many times from, let's say, food manufacturers or producers where they would love to sell their products in a separate province because it's close, like it's right there, and they have friends and family that want to buy their product, but it's incredibly difficult. Like, I don't know. I definitely agree that it's a lot easier to go after a large single market in the US. But
believe it or not, I'm gonna, from my personal experience, sending a package to the US is cheaper than sending a package across Canada to Vancouver.
That's ridiculous.
Canada Post, okay, very expensive. So if that's the case, then as a business, where do you want to sell? You want to sell to the U.S., right? And basically, it comes down to all these things where I think the government hasn't done a good job at supporting small businesses, supporting businesses locally, incentivizing them to ship within Canada, right? Like if you ship a product from one province to another, if you make that cost a fraction of what it would cost to ship to the U.S. or comparable, then yeah, of course you sell to Vancouver instead. So logistics, the cost of shipping, there's just too much cost, and there's not enough subsidy from government to help support these small businesses, to sell within Canada.
Bring back the Keystone, baby.
I think honestly that the trade piece, that's part and parcel of the trade conversation, is we need to, do we want to be self-reliant on our energy or not? Like, again, if the US wanted to cut off pipelines, the pipelines that West Canada supplies to Eastern Canada goes to the US. Like, why? Right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And it's interesting, just on the shipping point, I had this conversation recently where the distance between you, if you guys are considered in Toronto and I'm considered in Calgary, which I am, it's almost roughly the same distance for me to go to Austin, Texas, than it is for me to go to Toronto. So proximity is a huge part of that. And yes, we're one country, but to your point, Andrew, we are incredibly dispersed, and it's a huge landmass. So anything that requires that sort of like economy of scale with people and density, it starts to break down in Canada, and it's just not competitive. Wireless is a good example, postal, stuff like that, where you have to cover a large landmass to hit a small number of people. We're always going to lose those battles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think we do need to bring back some sense of nationalism to this country. Like I look around, I look outside, I don't see one Canadian flag. I look at the houses,
but
blocks, I could see it. There's not one.
I gotta give you this though. Trump did one thing, in his several weeks of in office, he brought together Canada and and made everybody very patriotic.
Yeah,
we'll see. We'll see if it sticks. Yeah, if it goes anywhere. I love all the Buy Canada posts on LinkedIn. Here's my product. It's Canadian.
You know what? We're in the brokerage business. And it's funny that, we start to see that, like some of these brokerages are like, we are 100% Canadian. We're not backed by any US PE entity or something like that. It becomes a marketing point now, which is interesting.
It is. Yeah, it is. So
Have you guys seen that? Have you seen anything like that? In your social media?
not really, not beyond like, again, we're Canadian, buy Canadian, all that kind of stuff. But again, I don't think it's going to stick unless there's regulatory changes. Unless the political class actually starts to take it seriously and make a concerted effort, I don't think it's going to change. Like, there's just too much red tape. There's too much regulatory burden, especially language wise. Like, it's insane, the language requirements selling into Canada versus the US. Oh, it's unbelievable.
Because of the
So
French, everything has to be in French. I thought in the U.S. though you have the Spanish requirement. No,
no, not
Everything, yeah,
federally.
yeah,
not
yeah. All
federally.
all products
It's a state
labels
thing.
has French and English on there.
Yeah.
See, so it's
And
federally
the
regulated.
Yeah, and there's just tons of import restrictions. Like, again, the standards, allegedly the regulation means it's safer, but I don't personally buy that. I think this is actually a separate topic that we should probably touch on, but a lot of the investigation that's going on in the US is around the sort of the breadth and depth of government. And how do we, the US is in considerable debt. Canada is in significant debt, but not as much proportionally. But both of them run massive bureaucratic public states that are in many cases getting in the way of business and entrepreneurship and starting a business and running a business and being successful. And are we going to be do we want to encourage a large state enterprise to create value and wealth for people, or do we want private enterprise to create value and wealth? And I think we need to be in Canada asking the same question that what appears to be what the election in the US was recently on, where people overwhelmingly said we want to slash and burn, we want to get Doge into government, we want to audit everything, we want to root out corruption and overspending. We have a similar problem. And so we really need to ask ourselves these questions, like, if we really intend to follow through, well, we need to make those changes. We need to get rid of the regulations and the red tape and stuff like that. And we need to hold our leaders and our politicians accountable if they don't do that.
I agree, and I think that the wave is coming here in Canada. You feel it when you talk to people. The kind of Pierre's platform that encompasses Pierre's platform is making government small and the people big. Meaning, what that means is less regulation, less bureaucracy, less red tape, and less fat, which is what you're seeing in the U.S. right now with all the minister of efficiency there, Mr. Musk, where they're making all these cuts and really trimming out the fat. So I think a lot of people want to see that in Canada now. From my, obviously it comes down to your political view, but from a lot of the individuals I speak to, they're really supporting that, Kyle.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and the final point from me is, I've always bought Canadian maple syrup, and I will continue buying Canadian maple syrup into the future. One of the
How about your
best.
Canadian stock portfolio, Andrew?
Well, that's a big one. We need to talk about that too. Another episode.
Yeah, let's end that here, Mike. Let's not get into that, please.
Not much
right.
content for that podcast.
No. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Let's give that a wrap for this episode. We'll look forward to chatting about some of these issues further in next week's episode. Talk to you then. Thanks, all.
Thank you.